Brothers and sisters, it is great to be here. With time constraints, I'm going to have to move along with this. Let me begin, though, with a quick story. A Palestinian friend of mine several years ago related this little story to me. He said, one time there was a sea turtle that was resting on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. And a scorpion came to him and said, I need to get across the sea here, the lake. Could you take me? And the sea turtle said, are you crazy? You're a scorpion. You'll sting me. And the scorpion said, why would I do that? He said, I promise you I won't touch you if you'll just give me a ride across the sea. And the turtle said, well, okay, I'll trust. So the scorpion got on the back of the turtle. The turtle got out into the water, and as they were going across, the scorpion kept inching up the back of the turtle until it was resting on its head. And about midway into the Sea of Galilee, the scorpion stung the turtle. The turtle said, why did you do that? You said you wouldn't do it. Why did you do that? Now, I'm going to die, but you're going to drown. To which the scorpion said, yeah, oh well, it's the Middle East. And it really kind of sums things up in a lot of different ways. It just doesn't make sense. I was thinking I could talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict in terms of contemporary issues like what's been happening in the last couple of years. But to be honest with you, it changes so dramatically, almost week by week, that it's hard to stay up with. And so I thought, that probably won't work. I think what I would do is to talk about what I think are the historical roots to this conflict. And I think if you understand the historical roots, then perhaps the conflict might be easier to understand. But I think it's important. An Arab scholar once said that the United States is judged primarily through Arab eyes by how we deal with this conflict. I believe that's true. I think that's a true statement. Based on my experiences in the Middle East and talking with Arabs in different parts of that world, they do look at us and they do primarily judge what we do and who we are by how we deal with this conflict. So let's talk about the conflict, okay? To understand its roots, it's impossible to start anywhere else, in my opinion, unless we start at this point. And this point is dealing with the Ottoman Empire. This is a vast empire that had a 400-year history. It's spread across North Africa, the Middle East, the Levant, and up into parts of Europe. And it was really impressive. This is an impressive empire. That's a little shot of, you see the square area up there. You'll notice if you go back, this is what it looked like in 1580, okay? This is what the empire looks like in that squared off region. It has diminished significantly. That's pretty, I think that's due very much to their administrative control of the areas that they governed. It was poor. Like many of the ancient empires in the ancient Near East, it succumbed to its own degradations, okay? But at the beginning of 1914, you have the Ottoman Empire, and it's making choices. And one of the choices it's going to make is, do we join the Axis powers of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire to fight? And they make a choice that a number of Turkish historians have looked back upon and said it was a terrible decision on our part, but they chose to side with Germany in the First World War. Um, One of the areas that they controlled were vast parts of Saudi Arabia, including a very, very important city, and that is the city of Mecca, which is the heart and soul of Islam. The British, at the beginning and the outset of World War I, are occupying Egypt. And they know that to win the war, they're going to have to take care of the Eastern Front, meaning they're going to have to deal with the Ottoman Empire. They look at a number of factors that they want to deal with, and one of them is in Arabia, there are a number of Bedouin tribes, loosely connected, but who very much despise the Ottoman Empire because the Ottomans are not Arabs, they're Turks. And the British have a plan, and that is to send in a number of agents, if you will, to try and organize these Arab tribes to revolt against the Ottoman Empire in Arabia and to begin to push them out with the help of the British, who will move in from Egypt up through Palestine, and they're going to have kind of this pincer movement. But it's a challenge because, quite honestly, the Bedouin tribes in Arabia do not trust outsiders, particularly the British. But the British persevere. They send in a number of agents, as I've said, and I call them agents, even though they were soldiers. One of them is T.E. Lawrence, that we affectionately call Lawrence of Arabia. He's probably the best known of the British soldiers who went into Arabia to try and organize this revolt. T.E. Lawrence, and again, there's a lot here with him, and I wish we had more time to talk about him because he's a fascinating individual. One of his contacts, okay, and one of the primary contacts of the British consulate in Egypt is this individual here, Hussein ibn Ali of the Hashemite clan. He is the Sharif of Mecca. That word Sharif today, or at least then, means that he is in fact a descendant, a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And the Prophet Muhammad was a member of the Hashemite clan, as is Hussein ibn Ali. He is seen as sort of the spiritual leader of the Arab world, particularly in Arabia. So they think he's a key person, but he's elderly, he's growing old. He has two sons. One, Abdullah, the son of Hussein ibn Ali, and the other son of Faisal. T.E. Lawrence develops a very good relationship with the eldest son, Faisal, and convinces him that the Arab forces should unite to drive out the Ottoman Turks. Well, I think the Arabs did a smart thing, and again, here's where history is convoluted and in disagreement. Because according to Lawrence and according to Arabs, the British government made some specific promises to this particular family, this leadership family. One of the promises, according to them and according to T.E. Lawrence in his own writings, is that the British government promised that at the conclusion of the war, when the Ottoman Empire had been defeated, when Germany had been defeated, that no foreign government, no Western government, such as Britain or anyone else, would remain on Arab soil. Specifically, the British government promised that the cities of Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem, which are 1, 2, and 3 in terms of sacredness to Muslims, would remain in Arab hands. With those promises, the Arabs, Bedouins of Arabia, gave their approval to join in the revolt. And so the Arabs began fighting the Ottoman Empire, and they were a great boost, a great help to the British. What was happening even during the war, as it was successfully being fought by the Arabs and the British, the French and the British were meeting secretly to determine what they would do with these large tracts of land at the end of this war. Despite promises that were made to the Arab people, the British and the French determined that they would split this area up into what they called zones of influence or zones of direct control. If you look at this carefully, you can see the blue zone is direct French control. That would be Syria and what would be called Lebanon today. The red zone, or the more pinkish zone, is direct British control. The A zone is French influence. The B zone is British influence. And that green is the international zone, and that green was reserved for Jerusalem. Jerusalem was to be an international zone in which there would be no one specifically in charge. No one especially, meaning the Arabs. So this is going on during the war, and the Arabs are unaware of it. They're not aware of this until actually toward the end of the First World War. And so what happens at the conclusion of the war is that the British and the French follow through with their plans to literally dissect the Middle East. And I think what's interesting is the modern Middle East today is a product of the British and the French intervention. They created what we call the Middle East today. And so you can see, if you will, one of the things that the British did is they said, we don't want Arabia, okay? Had they known that there was oil there, they would have changed their minds, okay? They didn't. They left Arabia to its own devices, and eventually it fell to the Saud family. But you can see the upper parts of the map in which you have tracts of land that are belonging to Britain and to France. And what happens at the end of the First World War is that the British are trying to appease as many people as possible, okay? And so one of the things that they do is they create a number of states. For example, they create the state of Iraq. And they make Faisal, who was one of the sons of Ibn Ali, they make him king of Iraq. They create the state, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and they make the other son, Abdullah, the king of Jordan. In fact, today, the monarchy, okay, Abdullah II, who is now the king of Jordan, he is the great-great-grandson, I believe, of this lineage that we're talking about. One of the other things that the British do is they try to keep Palestine as an international enclave, and that does not work. And so in 1917, 1918, 1919, the British are planning to assume control of Palestine. And in 1922, from the League of Nations, they received the mandate to control Palestine. And so if you're an Arab and you're an Arab historian, what you're going to do is sit back and say, we were betrayed, okay, by Britain and by France. Promises that were made were not kept. Arabia, okay, we have Arabia, but in a sense, the Ibn Ali family lost Arabia to Saud family, and they're asking questions like, how could this have happened? The British are extremely postured on this. they their claim is that no promises were never made to the Arabs, specifically for Palestine. And that's where the story needs to go now. We need to focus more on Palestine. The British occupied Palestine with their mandate from 1922 to 1947, okay? If you've ever been there, and I assume that some of you have, I know the first time that I ever went to West Jerusalem, it reminded me of parts of London, okay? Because it was created by the British, in a sense. And so they were there for a lengthy period of time. Get another close-up of the British mandate of Palestine, which also included Transjordan. The British were doing a couple of things during the mandate. One of the things that they were doing is they were trying to appease both sides, because in the 1930s and early 40s, you have Jews who are trying to flee from Europe, okay? Particularly prior to the Holocaust, and then during the Holocaust, and then immediately after the Holocaust. The British were, again, making, I'm going to sound anti-British here, okay? And you know what? I am, okay? I just am. I think they made a mess here. And I love the British. I served my mission in London. I've given this presentation there was a group visiting from England, some scholars, and they asked to meet with people who had expertise in the Middle East at BYU, and I gave this presentation to them. And I tried to soften it so that it wouldn't, but I just couldn't do it. And you know, it was pretty interesting because several of them came up after and said, "Yeah, you're right, we made a mess of it." I said, "Well, okay, then I'll continue to blame you for stuff. If I can get your support, I feel good about this." But they did a number of things. They were allowing Jews to come, Jewish refugees from Europe to come into Palestine. At the same time, they were making promises to the Arabs, to the Palestinians, who were what you call historic citizens of that area. And the British were saying to one group, okay, we're not going to let many Jews in here. To the other group, they were saying, we'll let as many as we can. And so they were playing both sides, and they were creating problems. They were creating problems for themselves primarily, because the Arabs on the one hand were saying, well, if this is how you're going to play the game, then we're going to do everything we can to drive you out. And if we have to resort to violence, we'll do it. And they did. The Jews, which is interesting, were also saying the same thing because they felt betrayed by the British, and they were saying to the British, we want you out of here, and if we have to resort to violence, we'll do it. The only time that the Jews pulled back on that threat of violence was during the Second World War, when they said, the British are fighting the Nazis. We dislike them more than we do the British, and therefore there will be no acts of terrorism or violence against the British during this war. After the war was over, then the Jewish underground forces began to move against the British. And by 1946, 1947, the British had had it. They essentially said, we can't handle a mandate anymore. In fact, we want out. We need to be out. So with broken promises, both sides, now we have Jews living in this land, we have Palestinians that are there, and both sides are saying we have broken promises here. The Arabs are probably screaming the loudest because they've said, and they continue to say, and this is something that's kind of important to understand in this conflict, is they maintain that from the very beginning, this land was promised to them, and that there would be absolutely no sharing. This was to be an Arab state, if you will. The Jews, on the other hand, are saying absolutely not. The British promised us that we would have land. We came here in what they call aliyahs, okay, in the early 1900s, and they continued to immigrate to this land up through the British Mandate. And their claim is, we came here, we're legal, we bought land, and they did. And you have to kind of see both perspectives here. So at the end of the day in 1947, the British are saying we got to get out, but in the process, they're saying we have to try to resolve the conflict between Jews and Arabs. And so what they do, and I'm going to skip ahead here, is UNSCOPS, which is the United Nations policy planners for the Middle East, devoted time to come up with a partition plan. And the partition plan in 1947 was to solve the dilemma. It was to solve the problem between Arabs and Jews by the creation of two separate states. This is 1947, okay? You can see in the purple, that is the Palestinian state that was created under this partition plan, and the brown is the state it was the Jewish state, which would later be called the State of Israel. Both parties, when they saw this partition plan from the United Nations, in fact, this is technically the official version of that partition plan, both parties said this is absolutely unacceptable. First, the Jews says, look what you've done. You have you have created a state that we can't govern. And the Palestinians weren't saying that. What they were saying was, you promised, there were promises made to us that this area, this land, would never, ever be shared with anybody, that this is Arab land. And so you have these two arguments that are going on. And both parties are asked by the United Nations, you need to make a decision, do you support this? The Jews, under David Ben-Gurion, initially said no, and then changed their mind and said yes, with some changes. One of the changes that Ben-Gurion insisted upon was that all of the Negev, that's everything south of what you see, Beersheba, all of that needed to be included in the State of Israel. The United Nations eventually agreed to that. The Arabs, on the other hand, were encouraged, and when I say the Arabs, I'm talking about the Palestinians, were encouraged by their neighbors, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, this enclave, if you will, of Arab states, to not accept this partition plan. In fact, they were implicitly told that once the British leave, we'll move in and literally drive the Jews into the sea, and you will have that land back. I've talked to Palestinians, a lot of Palestinians, and when you talk this history with them, they're very familiar with it. In fact, I've heard Palestinians say the worst thing that we ever did, the greatest mistake in our history, was to not accept this partition plan. We would have had a state. Instead, they chose to broker along with the other Arab countries, and in 1947, 48, when the British were gone, true to their word, these Arab countries invaded Palestine. And the Jews, now called Israelis, okay, had to fight for their lives, and they did. And you look back at their history, and you have to say, wow, outnumbered, outgunned, but they did a good job of trying to keep things together. The Arabs, on the other hand, didn't fare as well as they thought they would. The only country to really make an impact during that war were the Jordanians. Why is that? Because they were trained by the British. They were armed by the British, okay? Their military was essentially British, okay, except fought with Jordanians. And so at the end of the day, okay? That's what it looked like, okay? Because the Israelis were saying, all right, okay, you don't want to accept it, we'll fight, and when this is all over, whatever land we have, that's what we have. And so what you see is very interesting. And this is following the first war in 1948. By the way, the Israelis call it the War of Independence. Do you know what the Palestinians call it? El-Nakba. El-Nakba. It's an Arabic word that means disaster. They call it the disaster. And every year in May, I think May 15th, the Israelis celebrate their War of Independence, okay? And on that very same day, the Palestinians celebrate Al-Nakba. It's a day of mourning for Palestinians. And it's very interesting to be there and to see how both groups sort of approach this event in history. Well, you can see in the green what you have is land that is controlled by the Israelis. They took it. They said, you weren't willing to accept any kind of a peace deal to the Palestinians. Therefore, you started the military engagement, and everything we've taken is fair game. We keep it. The Palestinians, on the other hand, essentially had everything in yellow, except they didn't have it. All of that land that you see, includes Samaria and Judea, was occupied and taken by the Jordanian army. And all of that land becomes part of Jordan. It is literally annexed into the kingdom of Jordan, and it is called the West Bank of Jordan because it's on the west side of the Jordan River, but it is considered Jordanian territory, not Palestinian. And so when you talk to Palestinians and you say, so what has life been like? And I've talked to them, especially the older folk. They've said, we haven't known a day of freedom. Some of them remember the British occupation. Some, and Palestinians will refer to the Jordanians as an occupation. This was an occupation, okay? They weren't Palestinians, they were Jordanians, and they weren't worried about us. And so this map that you see, the little red slot down there is Gaza, and that is controlled by Egypt, okay? And so what we have happening here is these are pretty much the armistice lines between approximately 1947 to 1967. That's the way it looked. Jerusalem, if you'll look at Jerusalem, you'll notice that it's cut in half. Take a look at it. That's very interesting because Jerusalem was a city that was occupied on the east side by the Jordanians and on the west side by the Israelis, and that was from 1947 to 67. In fact, there are places that you can go in Jerusalem today to see where that dividing line was. If you've been there and you've seen the Jerusalem Center is built right on the dividing line between East and West Jerusalem. We're kind of right in the center of it. And it's kind of fascinating, but this is how it went for a number of years. And then something interesting happens. It's not interesting, it's actually a tragedy. In 1967, the Israelis were, and again, it depends on which historian you want to talk to, the Israelis claim that Egypt and Syria were preparing for a preemptive strike against Israel. This was in June of 1967. The Israelis, therefore, will claim that they conducted a preemptive strike against Egypt and Syria. And they did. This war lasted for approximately 6 days. It took the Egyptians pretty much by surprise at how effective the Israelis were at knocking out their air force, at knocking out their tank forces in the Sinai. The Syrians were no match for the Israelis. The Israelis pushed the Syrians off the Golan Heights, And all of a sudden, at the end of the day, they also pushed the Jordanians out of the West Bank. And at the conclusion of the fighting, and I have talked to Israelis who have said we ourselves were shocked at what we had at the end of the 6 days. They had everything. They now had pushed the Egyptians out of Gaza. They occupied Gaza. They occupied the West Bank. And they occupied the Golan Heights. Not only did they occupy these large tracts of land, they occupied the population, and the population in the West Bank was Palestinian. The population in the Gaza Strip was Palestinian. Okay, there weren't many Palestinians living in the the Golan Heights, but they had their hands full, because now not only do they occupy land, but they occupy people, and they're going to have to control them. I talked to an Israeli general who came and spoke at the Jerusalem Center. He's retired, and he made a fascinating statement. He said the worst mistake that Israel ever made, in my opinion, from a military perspective, was to, after we had taken the West Bank and Gaza, okay, after we had taken it and occupied it, he said the worst mistake we ever made was not to make peace with the Palestinians and to include them in some form of government. He said we have lived with this mistake now for a lot of years, and it's cost us. And it's still costing them, in my opinion. But here it stands now, this conflict, which has resulted in occupations. Let me go back before we go to that. One of the problems, the Israelis have had, in my opinion, a difficult time maintaining the occupation. It is unpopular with the general Israeli population, not popular. It's expensive, and it creates for a lot of people a moral dilemma, okay, about being what some have called prison keepers, guards, and so forth. And so over time, there have been attempts at negotiations, okay? The Oslo Accords in 1994, secret negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis to pull out of occupied lands and to allow the Palestinian to have more autonomy and control. I did research in the Gaza Strip in the mid-90s when it was still under Israeli occupation, and that was a fascinating experience to go in there with the United Nations and to talk with both sides. We went to a number of Palestinian institutions, talked, and we met with Israelis in some of the settlements in the Gaza Strip, and the military had just been notified that they were going to pull out of Gaza. They were leaving. But the settlements were not. They were going to be able to stay there for a while. But everything else would be given to the Palestinians. They would have autonomy. Yasser Arafat of the PLO would be coming back, and that would be his capital, and so forth. And so there was a lot of questions about what was going to happen. We went back on numerous occasions to do research. We went back shortly after the Israelis had pulled out. And actually, Bill Clinton had visited Gaza, the only American president, I think, to ever do that. And it was really interesting to go to Gaza and to see all these American flags flying everywhere. We were extremely popular at that time. And people were hopeful and excited and wanting the best because they now had their freedom and autonomy. It didn't work out. The Israelis have still maintained a fairly strict control over Gaza. I will sound very biased when I say this, but please trust me. Gaza is a prison in many ways. It is now controlled by Hamas, which is a tragedy in itself to have that organization running the show there. But what you see next is something else that happened, and that was Israel had to make some choices. And one of the choices they made, okay, after they occupied the land in 1967, was to build settlements in occupied territory. These are settlements that are very interesting to see. Sometimes these settlements start out as just a tent. Some Israelis will move in with a tent or a trailer, and they'll claim a little hilltop. And the government in the past was very willing to send in soldiers to protect that group until they received funding to start building buildings, okay? And so one of the problems we have with Elder Woods called it the dilemma, and it certainly is, what do you do with these settlements? Because as you look up here, you'll see all those blue dots that you see. Those are Israeli settlements. That map is actually dated. If I showed you one that was more updated, you would see a whole lot of more blue dots, okay? One of the other things that has caused great consternation has been the separation wall. And I don't think I included pictures. I should have done that. But Israel has built about a 50-foot high wall. How many of you have seen the separation wall? Okay, you know what I'm talking about here. It's huge. And it essentially goes all the way around occupied territory in the West Bank. It essentially seals in the Palestinians. The Israelis are claiming that that in doing so, it has curbed terrorist activity, and the statistics, quite frankly, are on their side. In terms of the moral dilemma, there are people who are saying we've just created a ghetto, like the Germans did with Warsaw. And so what you have happening now is a situation in which, in my opinion, it will be near to impossible to solve this conflict in a meaningful and a fair way. I think it's too complicated now. The settlements create a major problem. One of the other problems is the influx of Russian Jews. Today, in the state of Israel, approximately 25% of the population are Russian Jews. They speak Russian. It's interesting to be in Jerusalem and to see signs, okay, road signs that are in Hebrew, English, Arabic, Russian. And you see them all over the place. And the problem with the Russian Jews, the problem they've created for the state of Israel is they come and they're poor. Where do they put them? Well, they found the cheapest land is out here in the occupied territories. And so they're building more settlements to accommodate the greater influx of people that have been moving into the state of Israel. And it is complicated. Okay? And if you talk to Palestinians, what they will say is we have had broken promises and lies from the West, and we don't trust them. And there is this kind of overarching, or if you will, an underpinning amongst Arabs today to not trust the West. They're very, very skeptical of us. On the other hand, the Israelis will say, we're here fair and square. We came, we bought land initially when we came, and we have a historic right to be here. Each side has some interesting arguments, and you have to kind of play both of those out. But in terms of trying to figure this out, it's just it's a mess. And every time I would think that I was close to kind of even just understanding it, the variables change. Things change. And with it, the landscape changes. At one time, the Palestinian Authority were running the show, pretty much, in the West Bank and in Gaza. And the United States called for free elections, okay? And the Palestinians caved into the pressure, and they held free elections. I was living there when they had the elections. It was very interesting because who won those elections? Hamas, which is considered by the United States to be a terrorist organization, but they won it. According to the United Nations watchdogs who watched the elections, they said it was a fair election, and they won it. And all of a sudden, we have a split now in who is governing the Palestinians. Hamas, which is an extremist organization, versus the Palestinian Authority. And Since that time, the Palestinian Authority has pretty much kicked Hamas out of the West Bank, and they run the show on the West Bank, and Hamas runs the show in Gaza. And now, most recently, they've decided to join ranks and have one single government between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And it just changes frequently. So how is this going to be solved? In my opinion, a single word, millennium. I really believe that. I used to be hopeful, I really did, and I thought I could see avenues and ways where this could be solved in a fair and moral way, and I just can't see it. Elder Wood said, so you're talking about the Middle East today, right? He said, it's probably going to be all negative. I think that's what you said, wasn't it, Elder Woods? It's all negative. It pretty much is. Sorry to say it, but it is. But that's the Arab-Israeli conflict. It plays out in the lives of people, and that's the tragedy of this whole conflict. And it's long-standing, and it's going to continue. It will always be there, I'm afraid. When you talk, I have 5 Palestinian students in one of my classes right now, and you talk to them about living the occupation, and they have some incredible stories. They're all sad. You hear it. You talk to Israelis on the other side of that coin. You talk to Israelis who say, you know, I worry about sending my little kids to preschool. I'm worried about a terrorist attack, and that's always at the back of their mind as well. And so both these peoples are living this nightmare in many ways. And you know the tragedy of it, brothers and sisters, is that the average Israeli and the average Palestinian would like to see this settled, but they're up against the same rock. They don't know how, because it's just so complicated and driven by so many different factors. Well, that in a nutshell is the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's easier to understand if you understand the historic roots and you go back to the First World War and then come forward than it is to try to look at it today, because it makes no sense in a lot of different ways. So it's been a pleasure to be here. I know that many of you have contact with Arabs sometime. If you haven't, you will in your careers, and perhaps with Israelis as well. My message is they're both wonderful people. I love both people. They're just wonderful. Both, they're different. Each group is a bit different, but they're wonderful people, and the tragedy is still played out in their lives. But it's been good to be here. The Lord bless you. I salute your service. I'm grateful for you, for what you represent, and more importantly, for what you do. You bless the lives of people. You're good shepherds and good ministers, and you do God's work. And I pray the Lord's blessings for you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.